You've likely heard me say many times that we are all wounded, and I definitely believe that that is true. Today, I want to share with you a story, just kind of as an example, as well as how not trusting ourselves can sometimes show up and continue to be a little bit of a lingering struggle. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. So I'm going to share a little bit of a story of something that recently happened, but this is a bigger thing. It's this bigger than just this little story. So I'm going to start there though. So just relatively recently, I was participating in a forum for Etsy shop owners. I'm new to Etsy and there's a lot to learn. I've got lots of questions. And I had just posed a question in the forum. And so I was scrolling through a little bit and somebody had posed another question asking for an opinion. I commented. And somebody replied to my comment, and context is a little bit important here, but I'm not going to go into the whole thing. But she responded to my comment saying that if I am messaging people on Etsy, that she wouldn't do that, and it's very spammy, and she said some other things too. But in reading her response, I was a little bit confused because I thought she might be saying that even if somebody is messaging you, that she doesn't think it's a good idea to respond with a follow-up or something along that line. So I was really confused and genuinely wanting to understand what she was saying. And so I responded back and asked for clarification. I said, "Are you saying this?" And in parentheses, I put genuinely interested in your thoughts, because I know that sometimes the way that we write things or the way that people read things, it can be misunderstood. And so she responded back to me in a way that didn't really clarify and left me more confused. But I recognized that she likely misunderstood what I was saying in my original comment, that she kind of missed part of the context related to the original post. And so my response back to her was that I was still a little confused because it still didn't make complete sense to me what she was saying. I said, "But you don't necessarily need to respond, but just to clarify, because I assumed that she misunderstood a particular part, to clarify, this is what I was meaning, not sending an unsolicited message." And I anticipated that that would be the end of it. She ended up responding back and, so when I realized that she likely misunderstood that part, I went back to my original comment and I edited it to just make it very clear that that sentence was in response to the screenshot that the original poster had put in her question, so that nobody else would be confused by that. So she responded back and said, "In your unedited comment or pre-edited comment, this is what you said." And she shared an image, and I didn't look at the image at first. And I thought, well, yes, that's exactly why I went in and edited it, so that people wouldn't be confused. But I looked at the screenshot the image that she shared, and it was a screenshot of my original comment. And immediately I felt a little confused, but also incredibly surprised, because I thought, what must be happening internally for her that she felt the need, and this isn't a judgment, this is the reality of how we experience things, but what must be going on within her to feel the need to share a screenshot of my comment to prove something to me. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more. And there was a part of me that actually felt a bit of sadness, thinking about how it feels to go through life like that, because I went through so much of my life feeling the need to prove things. And there were stages of it getting better. And for the most part, generally speaking, I don't really feel the need to do that. But there are times that it can come up. And an important thing about this, and this is part of the reason I'm sharing this story, because I know that a lot of people will be able to relate to this to some degree. Because I think as survivors of trauma, we all struggle with learning to really trust ourselves. And I've said many times that I think that when it comes to healing, that is like the final leg of the journey, so to speak, that learning to really trust ourselves is something that I feel like is an ongoing practice, something that I can still struggle with at times. So recognizing the internal feelings that are happening, the questioning in your own mind that can happen in those moments, knowing how difficult it can feel, and it can even end up creating anger. And anger can look different ways, but it can, like, it's on that spectrum of anger. And it made me think about how no matter who we're interacting with, no matter what setting we're in, everybody has issues. Everybody is wounded, everybody struggles, and how those wounds or struggles manifest might look a little bit different. But often there's a lot of similarity. Now, I don't know what this person's wounds are. I don't know what she was feeling internally. But to feel the need to screenshot an original comment to prove something, just the dialogue, the internal dialogue, and the feeling that it creates isn't something that feels good. And if this is happening in a very reasonable adult conversation, what must that look like in situations that are actually really vulnerable and really difficult? And again, this isn't a judgment, and I really truly mean that. It's not a judgment about this person at all, but I think it is such a great example of how things that we struggle with can come up in so many different ways and places. And so another thing that I think is most important, actually, probably about this, is going back to the idea that it is something that so many of us struggle with, trusting ourselves. And I mentioned the idea of needing to prove something, right? And often it expresses itself as needing to prove to somebody else. But what's really happening in those moments is ultimately we're needing to prove to ourselves. It's not really about the other person. That might be a part of it, but the biggest piece, the piece that's creating that feeling and the need to respond, that's all about us. That is all about our lack of trust within ourselves. What we think, what we remember, what we feel, how we show up, what we want and what we need. It's all about that. And for this person in that situation to feel the need to prove that I wrote it one way and then edited to clarify, that doesn't feel good. And I can say that because I have been there. Not in the exact same way, but some of you might remember me talking about a situation. This would have been, well, over 10 years ago at this point. It's the thing that led me back to therapy and a big recognition of something. But I had an office, and she and I shared this big office space together. We had our individual offices. And I have spoken about this, so I'm not going to go into all of it. But what came from that situation ultimately, and what ended up taking me back to therapy, is that I found myself feeling physically not well. I was stressed out. I avoided trying to interact with her. It just created a lot of difficulty, I think, for both of us, but it was causing me to question so much about what I remember and what I believe to be true. And because of that, I would spend literally hours going through every single email looking for proof that she did in fact say something. Because much of what was happening is she would say, I didn't say that, or basically some variation of, I didn't say that. When many of the decisions that I was making were based on what she did say. So I felt really confident in my memory of what she said, because my memory tends to be either I don't remember, which is often the case, or I remember pretty clearly. Now, there are times that I don't remember something very clearly, and I will just say, I don't really remember, or that's not the way that I remember it, but I could be wrong, or something along those lines, because that does happen without a doubt. But there are some things that I remember really clearly. Sometimes that I am really intentional about making sure that what I'm hearing or experiencing is accurate. And a lot of the conversations that we had been having were about how to run the office, how to set up the office, because it was really kind of my thing, and we were partnering together in it, in a sense. And so I would spend hours going through every single email to confirm to myself that what I remembered was in fact true. And there were some things that might have been a verbal conversation and were not in emails. And on those occasions, I actually questioned myself. Actually, I questioned myself every time that she said something. That's why I ended up going to therapy, because while I remembered it pretty clearly on one hand, because of the way that she expressed it, which was pretty aggressive, it caused me to question myself. So I would go back through the emails to prove that the way that I remembered it, what I remembered, was in fact true. Now, the impact that it was having on me wasn't just about proving that she said that those chairs were a certain way or whatever. It was to prove to myself that I could trust my memory. That's really what it was about. That I wasn't crazy. And in going to therapy, I recognized all of that. And that was the time that I recognized that what was happening in this situation with my office mate, who was technically, I think she was old enough to be my mother. But that situation actually was somewhat familiar to something that happened when I was about 8 years old, when my mom told me that I was having a bad dream and to go back to bed. I knew that what happened had happened. It just happened, but my mom was telling me I had a bad dream. And there were other things. It wasn't just that single moment in time. But that reinforced all the other doubt that I carried, that we all really carry, because part of how we cope with the difficulty, the trauma, the doubt, the fears, the feelings, is by telling ourselves that what we know to be true isn't as true as we think it is, right? We tell ourselves it's not that bad. We tell ourselves they didn't really mean it. We tell ourselves that we shouldn't feel the way that we do feel, that it's not a big deal. That is how we cope. And that leads to an incredible amount, a deep sense of distrust within what we remember, how we think, how we feel, what we need, all of that. And when my mom said that to me, it reinforced all of that, even though it had just happened and I had a clear memory of what just happened. So learning to trust ourselves, for me, learning to trust myself, I still second guess myself. Depending on what this situation is, I don't even know quite how to say it, second guess myself a few different times. But that is a huge thing for so many of us. And one of the ways that it can manifest itself, so there are different ways that it can. It may not look this way for you specifically, but I think for probably a lot of you, there's an aspect of it that you might be able to relate to. Maybe it's even proving somebody else wrong, or always feeling the need to be right. And I will say too that it's not really about needing to be right. Like a lot of times there's this idea that for people generally, like you always need to be right. And certainly there are people like that. But I also know that for a lot of us, it's not about needing to be right. Like with that person in the whole email situation, I didn't need to be right. I needed to know that I could trust my own memory. That was purely what it was about. And I can't speak to what it was about for this person on the Etsy forum thing. I don't know. I don't know what her wounding is. I don't know how, well, I can tell you one way that it tends to show up. It might show up in other ways too. But I don't know exactly what that means for her. I don't know exactly what was going on for her. But I can fairly confidently say that there is something within her that, whether she fears that people don't believe her, whether she feels the need to be right, or whether it's more similar to me and she doesn't trust herself and needs to have evidence of the fact that the way she responded made sense given the circumstances or something along that line, I don't know. So I share all of this with you as an example that we are all wounded, because I think a lot of times we judge ourselves for struggling, and recognizing that everybody is wounded and that those wounds show up in all the places in our lives, not just in really vulnerable conversations or intimate relationships. That everybody's wounding can show up in everywhere in our lives. It can show up everywhere, anywhere, kind of at any time. Recognizing that can help reduce some of that shame. Maybe it can help you be a little bit more compassionate and understanding with yourself. Maybe it can also help you recognize that for other people, when their issues are showing up, that it really may not be about you. In fact, it really likely isn't about you. Her feeling the need to do that wasn't about me, because I did read through it, actually. I read through my comments. Did I say anything? And not because I was feeling a lot of anxiety about it, but if I did, I wanted to ease her struggle a little bit. And I didn't feel like a need to do that. It wasn't a drive. But again, recognizing like there was a little bit of sadness that she's feeling so much about it that she would do that. But I read through it again. So even in a situation when like we can trust to a degree that we didn't necessarily do anything wrong, it can be helpful to also acknowledge that other people responding in a way really isn't about us. Because there was a time, honestly, in which I might have responded back to her to prove that my original comment in the context given made sense. Like I didn't say it wrong or do something wrong or anything like that. There was a time that I might have felt the need to do that. And in the bigger picture, there was a time that if that had happened, I actually would have likely left the forum altogether, because her questioning me would have brought up so much doubt and ultimately shame that I would have likely just ran. So another example of healing happens progressively, right? It's progress. But there might have been a time when, or there definitely would have been a time when I would have felt the need to prove to myself, ultimately, that I didn't actually do something wrong in that situation. So wherever you tend to fall in that, whether it's something happening within you or you're recognizing it with somebody else, try to remember that. We're all wounded. There's not something wrong with you and everybody else has got it all together and never struggles. And that sometimes other people's wounds can show up in ways that maybe are less than ideal, or that can cause us to question ourselves a little bit. And that doesn't make the other person bad or wrong necessarily, though I will say that in her responding, and then she ended up making another comment that just reinforced the idea that she's got some struggles. Like, okay, that might just be somebody that I wouldn't necessarily make an effort to try to engage with. But that's not a judgment about her as an individual. But sometimes we do need to make those decisions, right? So if you are engaging with somebody and there's something about it that just doesn't feel good to you, it's okay to make those decisions. Somebody doesn't have to be bad or do something wrong in order for us to feel like we don't want to engage or we do need to set a boundary. So I'd love to hear from you. Can you relate to any of that? Maybe your lack of self-trust shows up in different ways. Maybe even take a few moments to just sit and reflect. Maybe other people needing to prove to themselves first and foremost, but maybe bring out evidence of things to prove that you're wrong. Maybe that creates something for you. Are you aware of what that might be? Share in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. So, thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. Make sure to give it a thumbs up if you found it helpful. Thank you again for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.